A flight of dreams turned sour. Carlos Hernandez adjusted his daughter Sophia's backpack, making sure it was secure as they moved through the bustling airport terminal. His wife, Maria, walked beside him, her arm lightly resting on his, while their son Diego trailed behind, his eyes wide with excitement. This trip had been in the making for months, a dream vacation to celebrate their 10th wedding anniversary and offer their kids an unforgettable experience. For once, life's chaos had taken a back seat to happiness. Their destination was Cancun, a vibrant city known for its azure waters and sun-soaked beaches. Sophia, 9 years old and endlessly curious, couldn't stop chattering about the snorkeling adventures she'd read about online. Diego, 5 and full of boundless energy, was more interested in the idea of building sandcastles, bigger than the ones he saw in cartoons. Carlos and Maria had exchanged amused smiles, sharing a silent understanding. This trip was as much for their kids as it was for them. A break from the grind, a reminder of why they worked so hard. The family reached the gate, the final stop before their much-anticipated vacation began. The atmosphere was electric, filled with the hum of conversations and the distant buzz of announcements echoing through the terminal. Sophia tugged on Maria's sleeve, pointing out the large windows showcasing planes taxiing in the distance. "Is that our plane, Mom?" Sophia asked, her voice filled with wonder. "No, mi amor," Maria replied, crouching to meet her daughter's gaze. "Ours is even bigger." Carlos chuckled, watching the exchange. He'd always admired Maria's patience with their children, a trait he sometimes lacked. He felt a surge of gratitude for her, for their little family, and for the opportunity to share this adventure together. Soon, the boarding call came, and they joined the line of passengers shuffling toward the plane. As they stepped into the cabin, the children's excitement was palpable. Sophia clutched her stuffed dolphin tightly, while Diego gawked at the rows of seats and overhead compartments. "Welcome aboard," said a cheerful flight attendant as they entered. Her smile was warm, and Carlos felt a momentary ease. He nodded in return and guided his family to their seats near the window. Maria settled in first, making sure Diego had his seatbelt fastened, while Sophia eagerly claimed the window seat. Carlos slid into his seat beside Maria, feeling a wave of contentment as he observed his children's joy. Everything seemed perfect. That perfection, however, was fleeting. As passengers stowed their belongings and settled in, another flight attendant appeared in the aisle. She was tall, with a name tag that read Emily. Her face was a mask of professionalism, but there was something about her demeanor that felt off. Unlike her colleagues, who moved with an easy grace and friendliness, Emily carried herself with a rigid, almost mechanical efficiency. Her eyes scanned the cabin, briefly meeting Carlos's gaze before moving on. The look was fleeting but unsettling. Carlos brushed it off. He wasn't one to read too much into things. Maybe she was just having a bad day. The boarding process wrapped up, and the cabin crew began their safety demonstrations. Carlos noticed Emily walking down the aisle, checking seatbelts and tray tables. When she reached their row, she stopped, her gaze landing squarely on Maria. "Your seat needs to be upright, ma'am," Emily said curtly, her tone devoid of warmth. Maria glanced at her seat back, confusion flickering across her face. "It is upright," she replied politely. Emily's expression hardened. "No, it's not. Fix it now." Carlos could feel the tension rising. He leaned forward slightly, trying to diffuse the situation. "Excuse me, but the seat is upright. Is there a problem?" Emily's eyes flicked to him, cold and unyielding. "Just follow the rules," she snapped. "It's not that hard." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Carlos felt his chest tighten with indignation. This wasn't about a seatback. It was about the tone, the attitude, the way Emily looked at them, as though they were beneath her. Maria adjusted the seat anyway, even though it didn't need it. "There," she said softly, her voice strained. "Is that better?" Emily didn't respond. She simply walked away, leaving a trail of tension in her wake. Carlos exchanged a glance with Maria, who looked as bewildered as he felt. "What was that about?" she whispered. "I don't know," Carlos replied, keeping his voice low. "But it wasn't right." The children, sensing the unease, fell silent. Sofia clutched her stuffed dolphin tighter, her earlier excitement replaced by uncertainty. Diego looked between his parents, his small brow furrowed in confusion. Carlos took a deep breath, trying to shake off the encounter. It wasn't worth ruining their trip over a rude flight attendant. But as the plane began to taxi down the runway, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that this wasn't the last they'd hear from Emily. The flight had barely reached cruising altitude when Emily returned, this time with the beverage cart. As she stopped at their row, Carlos decided to keep things simple. "2 waters, please," he said, his tone neutral. Emily didn't move. Instead, she tilted her head, a faint smirk playing on her lips. "Are you sure you want water?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. Carlos frowned. "Yes, I'm sure." Emily glanced at Maria, then back at Carlos. "You don't look like the type who drinks water," she said, her words laced with implication. "Maybe a soda, or something stronger." The insinuation was clear, and Carlos felt his face heat with anger. Maria stiffened beside him, her hands clenching in her lap. "Just water," Carlos said firmly, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Emily rolled her eyes but finally handed over the cups of water. She moved on without another word, leaving Carlos and Maria in stunned silence. This wasn't just a bad day or a simple misunderstanding. It was deliberate, it was personal, and it was wrong. Carlos felt his jaw tighten as he glanced at his children. Sofia was staring out the window, pretending not to notice, while Diego fidgeted with his seatbelt. They didn't deserve this. No one did. Maria placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "Don't let her ruin this for us," she said softly. But even as she spoke, Carlos could see the hurt in her eyes. He nodded, though the words felt hollow. Deep down, he knew this was far from over. Something had to be done, but for now, all he could do was hold his family close and hope the rest of the flight would pass without further incident. Little did he know, the worst was yet to come. The line crossed. The steady hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin, a monotonous backdrop to the unsettling atmosphere surrounding the Hernandez family. Carlos stared out the window, his jaw tight as he watched the clouds roll by. He couldn't shake the earlier confrontation with Emily. It wasn't just her words. It was the way she said them, the tone that felt less like casual rudeness and more like targeted malice. Maria leaned back in her seat, her hand resting on his. She'd always been the calming force in their relationship, the one who could find light in the darkest moments. But even she seemed shaken. Her fingers traced slow, absent-minded patterns over his hand, as if trying to comfort both him and herself. Sofia and Diego, sensing the tension, had grown unusually quiet. Sofia held her stuffed dolphin tightly, her little face pressed against the window. Diego, always restless, now sat frozen, his small hands gripping the armrests. Carlos glanced at his children and felt a wave of guilt. This was supposed to be a magical adventure, a memory they'd treasure for years. Instead, it had turned into something else, a lesson in how cruel the world could be, even when you least expected it. Emily's presence loomed large, even when she wasn't near them. Every time she walked down the aisle, her gaze seemed to linger on their row, her lips curling into a faint smirk, as though she were silently daring them to say something. Carlos clenched his fists, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. He wasn't a man who enjoyed conflict, but he wasn't one to back down from it either, especially when it came to his family. Then it happened. The moment that took everything from uncomfortable to unbearable. Emily approached their row again, this time without the beverage cart. She stopped abruptly, her eyes scanning their faces before settling on Diego. Her expression hardened into something cold and impersonal, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Excuse me," she said sharply, "your son needs to stop kicking the seat in front of him." Maria looked up, startled. Diego's feet, small and dangling several inches above the floor, weren't even close to the seat back. Carlos immediately noticed this and frowned. Diego hasn't been kicking the seat, Carlos said evenly. He's too short to reach it. Emily crossed her arms, her gaze shifting between Carlos and Maria. Passengers have been complaining, she insisted, her tone sharp and accusatory. Maria straightened in her seat, her voice firm but calm. I can assure you, Diego hasn't done anything. He's been sitting quietly the whole time. Emily's eyes narrowed. So you're saying I'm lying? She snapped. Carlos felt his pulse quicken, his patience wearing thin. No one's saying that, he said carefully. But maybe there's been a mistake. Our son hasn't caused any problems. Emily's face twisted into a sneer. Mistake, she repeated mockingly. Right. Because rules don't apply to people like you. Carlos froze, the weight of her words crashing down on him. People like you. The implication was clear, cutting through the air like a blade. Maria's face paled, her eyes widening in shock. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Even Sophia, wise beyond her years, seemed to understand the gravity of what had just been said. She reached for her mother's hand, her small fingers trembling. Carlos stood, his voice steady but laced with anger. That's enough, he said firmly. You don't get to speak to my family like that. Emily didn't back down. Instead, she leaned closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. If you can't control your family, maybe you shouldn't be flying. The words echoed in Carlos's ears, each one a deliberate jab meant to provoke. His fists clenched at his sides as he struggled to keep his composure. He wanted to yell, to demand an explanation, but he knew that losing his temper would only make things worse. His children were watching, and he had to set an example. Maria placed a hand on his arm, her touch both a plea and a reminder. Carlos, she said softly, her voice trembling. Let it go. Carlos hesitated, his anger warring with his better judgment. Finally, he took a deep breath and sat back down, his movements slow and deliberate. This isn't over, he said quietly, his gaze locked on Emily. Emily straightened, her smirk returning. We'll see about that, she said before turning on her heel and walking away. The rest of the cabin had grown eerily quiet, passengers pretending not to notice the confrontation, but clearly aware of the tension. Carlos could feel their eyes on him, a mix of curiosity and discomfort. He hated the attention, but more than that, he hated the helplessness coursing through him. He had always prided himself on being able to protect his family, but now he felt powerless. Maria squeezed his hand, her expression a mix of sadness and resolve. We'll get through this, she said softly. Together. Carlos nodded, though his heart felt heavy. This wasn't just about one rude flight attendant. It was about something deeper, something ugly and pervasive that he had hoped his children wouldn't have to face so young. As the flight continued, Emily made no effort to hide her disdain. She brushed past their row repeatedly, bumping into Carlos's arm without apology. When Maria requested a blanket for Diego, Emily returned with one that was visibly torn and stained, her smirk daring them to complain. Carlos seethed in silence, unwilling to give her the satisfaction. But the breaking point came during the meal service. When the cart reached their row, Emily handed out meals to the passengers on either side of them, but skipped their seats entirely. Carlos waited, thinking it was an oversight, but Emily made no move to correct it. Excuse me, Carlos said, his voice tight. We haven't received our meals. Emily glanced at him, her expression bored. We're out, she said flatly. Carlos's jaw tightened. Out? How is that possible? Emily shrugged, her tone dismissive. Maybe you should have asked sooner. Maria's eyes filled with tears, though she quickly blinked them away. Sophia and Diego, too young to fully understand but old enough to sense the injustice, looked up at their parents with confused, worried expressions. Carlos took a deep breath, his voice trembling with restrained anger. "This is unacceptable." Emily smirked. "Feel free to file a complaint," she said before moving on. Carlos sat back, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles turned white. He felt like he was on the edge of exploding, his anger bubbling dangerously close to the surface. But he knew that wouldn't solve anything. He needed to think, to figure out how to handle this in a way that would protect his family and hold Emily accountable. As the flight continued, Carlos noticed something unexpected. A few passengers around them began to offer quiet words of support. A woman across the aisle handed Sophia a bag of snacks, her expression sympathetic. An older man in the row ahead turned around and gave Carlos a reassuring nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him that not everyone in the world was like Emily. By the time the plane began its descent, Carlos had made up his mind. He wasn't going to let this go. Emily's behavior had crossed every line of decency, and she needed to be held accountable, not just for his family's sake, but for anyone else who might have suffered at her hands. As the plane touched down and the passengers began to disembark, Carlos turned to Maria, his voice steady with quiet determination. "We're not letting her get away with this," he said. Maria nodded, her expression resolute. "We'll do it together." And as they stepped off the plane, the Hernandez family was no longer just passengers on a flight. They were a family united, ready to stand up against the injustice they had faced. The captain's intervention. The Hernandez family stepped into the brightly lit terminal, their spirits weighed down by the events of the flight. The once excited chatter of Sofia and Diego had faded into a silence that felt too heavy for children their age. Carlos looked at his wife and children, his heart aching. This was supposed to be a joyous start to their dream vacation, not a lesson in prejudice and humiliation. Carlos was determined not to let it end there. As the family gathered their belongings and prepared to navigate the airport, a voice over the intercom announced the names of several passengers, including Carlos and Maria. The request was calm yet authoritative, instructing them to report to the gate agent before leaving the terminal. Carlos felt a spike of unease. What now? Had Emily lodged some kind of complaint against them? The thought filled him with both dread and anger. Maria looked at him, her brow furrowed in worry. "Do you think it's about what happened on the flight?" she asked. Carlos nodded, his jaw set. "Probably, but whatever it is, we'll handle it." With the children in tow, they approached the gate counter, where a uniformed captain was waiting. His posture was confident but approachable, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on the Hernandez family. Carlos recognized him as the captain of their flight, a man who had only been visible during the safety announcements and occasional updates from the cockpit. He hadn't expected to see him again, let alone under these circumstances. "Mr. and Mrs. Hernandez?" the captain asked, his voice steady and calm. "Yes, that's us," Carlos replied, his tone guarded. The captain extended a hand, his expression sincere. "Captain William Grant, I'd like to speak with you privately, if that's all right." Carlos hesitated, glancing at Maria. She gave a small nod, her trust in him evident. "All right," Carlos said, "but I'd like my wife to join us." "Of course," the captain said, his tone understanding. "There's a private room just down the hall. I think it's best we talk there." As they followed the captain, Sofia tugged on Carlos's hand. "Papi, are we in trouble?" she asked, her voice trembling. Carlos knelt down, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "No, mi amor. We're just going to talk. Stay close to Mama, okay?" Sofia nodded, her small face set with determination. Diego clutched Maria's hand tightly, his wide eyes reflecting his unease. Carlos hated that his children were caught in this situation, but he resolved to ensure they saw their parents stand tall, no matter what came next. The room they entered was small but comfortable, with a table and a few chairs. Captain Grant gestured for them to sit and closed the door behind them. His demeanor was professional yet empathetic, a stark contrast to Emily's abrasive attitude. "I want to start by apologizing," Captain Grant said, his voice firm but tinged with regret. What happened on that flight was unacceptable. Carlos's eyes widened in surprise. He hadn't expected an apology, let alone one from the captain himself. "You're aware of what happened?" he asked cautiously. "Yes," the captain replied, his expression darkening. "Multiple passengers brought it to my attention during the flight. Some even recorded parts of it. After reviewing the reports and footage, I felt it was necessary to address this directly." Maria placed a hand over her heart, her breath catching. "You mean?" Others noticed. Captain Grant nodded. "You weren't alone in feeling mistreated. Several passengers expressed concern about the way you were spoken to and the targeted nature of the flight attendant's behavior." Carlos felt a wave of relief wash over him, mixed with a renewed sense of anger. He wasn't imagining it. He wasn't overreacting. What Emily had done was wrong, and others had seen it too. "I want you to know," Captain Grant continued, "that behavior like that has no place in our airline. We hold our staff to the highest standards, and Emily's actions today fell far below those standards." Maria's voice trembled as she spoke. "We felt so powerless. We didn't want to cause a scene, but it was humiliating." Captain Grant's expression softened, and he leaned forward slightly. "I can't begin to imagine how that must have felt for you and your family. But I want to assure you that Emily will be held accountable for her actions. The airline has a strict zero-tolerance policy for discrimination and harassment, and this incident will be thoroughly investigated." Carlos appreciated the captain's words, but he couldn't help feeling skeptical. "With all due respect, Captain, how do we know anything will actually change? It's easy to say she'll be held accountable, but what if this happens to someone else?" The captain met his gaze, his expression resolute. "I understand your concerns, Mr. Hernandez. That's why I'm personally filing a formal report with our corporate office, along with the passenger complaints and video evidence. I'll make sure this issue is addressed at the highest level." Maria squeezed Carlos's hand, her eyes glistening with emotion. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means a lot to us." "There's more," Captain Grant said, his tone softening. "I'd like to offer your family a personal apology on behalf of the airline. Your experience today doesn't reflect who we are or what we stand for. As a gesture of goodwill, we'd like to upgrade your return flight to first class and cover the cost of your accommodations during your stay in Cancun." Carlos was stunned. The offer was generous, far more than he'd expected, but it didn't erase the pain of what had happened. Still, he appreciated the captain's efforts to make things right. "Thank you," Carlos said finally, his voice steady. "We appreciate the gesture. But what matters most to us is knowing that this won't happen to anyone else." Captain Grant nodded, his respect for Carlos evident. "I can't promise perfection, but I can promise you this. I'll do everything in my power to ensure that our airline learns from this and improves." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling over them. Finally, Captain Grant stood and extended his hand once more. "If there's anything else I can do to support your family, please don't hesitate to let me know." Carlos shook his hand, feeling a flicker of hope. "Thank you, Captain. That means a lot." As they left the room, Carlos felt a mix of emotions: relief, gratitude, and a lingering sense of injustice. But most of all, he felt a renewed determination. This wasn't just about his family. It was about standing up against prejudice and ensuring that no one else would have to endure what they had. As they made their way through the terminal, Sophia tugged on his sleeve. "Papi, does this mean we're going to have a better flight home?" Carlos smiled, kneeling to her level. "Yes, mi amor. And it means we're going to have a great vacation, too." Sophia's face lit up, her earlier worry fading. "Good," she said firmly, "because I still want to see the dolphins." Carlos chuckled, ruffling her hair. "We'll see the dolphins," he promised. And so much more. As the Hernandez family stepped into the warmth of the Cancun air, they left the bitterness of the flight behind, ready to embrace the adventure ahead. But deep down, Carlos knew their story wasn't over yet. There was still a fight to be fought, and he was ready to see it through, both for his family and for every family who deserved to travel without fear of prejudice. Strength in unity. The warmth of Cancun's tropical air greeted the Hernandez family as they exited the terminal, a stark contrast to the cold tension they had left behind on the plane. Carlos inhaled deeply, trying to let the soft sea breeze wash away the frustration of their flight. Maria, ever the optimist, offered a reassuring smile. "We're here now," she said gently. "Let's make this a trip to remember, for the right reasons." Sofia and Diego, their earlier unease replaced by the excitement of the unknown, darted toward a waiting taxi. "Papi." "Mom, look," Diego called, pointing at a colorful poster of dolphins adorning the side of a nearby kiosk. "Can we see them today?" Carlos chuckled, grateful for their resilience. "Not today, champ," he said, lifting Diego into his arms. "But soon. First, we're going to check into the hotel and relax, okay?" Diego pouted briefly before nodding, his curiosity quickly turning to the bustling activity around him. Sofia, clutching her stuffed dolphin, stared wide-eyed at the rows of palm trees lining the streets. "It's so beautiful," she murmured. Maria leaned into Carlos as they walked. "They bounce back so quickly," she whispered. "I wish I could do the same." Carlos squeezed her hand, his voice low but firm. "We'll get there. Together." A new kind of support. The hotel was as stunning as the pictures had promised. Its grand lobby boasted towering glass windows that framed the ocean beyond, and the welcoming staff added a touch of warmth that felt like an antidote to the coldness they'd experienced earlier. The Hernandez family was escorted to a spacious suite with a balcony overlooking the turquoise waters. It was perfect, a sanctuary after the storm. As Maria unpacked, Carlos stepped onto the balcony, his thoughts drifting back to the flight. Captain Grant's words had been reassuring, and the offer to upgrade their return journey was generous. But Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that something more needed to be done. What had happened wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger issue. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking his reverie. Pulling it out, he saw a notification from social media. A passenger from their flight had uploaded a video of Emily's treatment of his family, and it was quickly gaining traction. The caption read, "Witnessed this family endure unacceptable behavior on our flight today. This needs to stop." Carlos's heart raced as he watched the footage. It captured Emily's sharp tone, her pointed comments, and the way she dismissed Maria's requests. The replies and comments were a mix of outrage and support. "How can someone in customer service act like this? Disgusting. That poor family. I hope they're okay. What airline is this? I'll never fly with them again unless they fix this." Maria stepped out onto the balcony, her brow furrowed as she noticed Carlos' expression. "What is it?" she asked, concern lacing her voice. Carlos showed her the video. Her hand flew to her mouth as she watched, her eyes filling with tears. "People are speaking up for us," she said, her voice trembling. He nodded, feeling a mix of gratitude and discomfort. "It's good that others noticed, but this is bigger than just us. This is about making sure this kind of thing doesn't happen to anyone else." Maria placed a hand on his arm. "What are you thinking?" Carlos hesitated, then met her gaze. "I'm thinking we need to do more. Not just accept the apology and the upgrade, but really make our voices heard. If people are willing to support us, maybe we can use this to push for change." Maria nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "I'll support whatever you decide. Just promise me we'll still make time for the kids to enjoy this trip." Carlos smiled, his resolve strengthened by her encouragement. "I promise." The call for justice. That evening, after the children had fallen asleep, Carlos and Maria sat on the balcony, illuminated by the soft glow of the moonlight reflecting off the ocean. Together, they drafted a statement about their experience, sharing their story on social media. Carlos wrote from the heart, detailing the humiliation they'd faced and the importance of addressing discrimination in all forms. "We were supposed to be celebrating as a family," the post read, "but instead, we were made to feel like we didn't belong. This isn't just about us. It's about ensuring no one else has to endure this kind of treatment. Everyone deserves respect, regardless of their background or where they come from." Maria helped edit the post, adding her own perspective. "We're not sharing this to seek attention or pity," she wrote. "We're sharing this because we believe in standing up against injustice. Change starts with awareness." They attached the video from the passenger, credited the person who had taken it, and hit post. Within hours, the response was overwhelming. Messages of support poured in, not just from strangers but from friends and family who hadn't known what had happened. The video continued to circulate, catching the attention of news outlets and advocacy groups. By morning, Carlos's phone was flooded with notifications. A reporter from a prominent news network reached out, asking to interview the family. Representatives from passenger rights organizations offered to help them navigate the airline's complaint process. Even Captain Grant sent a message, reaffirming his commitment to ensuring justice was served. Maria looked at Carlos over breakfast, her expression a mix of amazement and trepidation. "This is a lot," she admitted. "Are we ready for this?" Carlos reached across the table, taking her hand. "We didn't ask for this, but now that it's happening, we have a chance to make a difference. We owe it to our kids and to everyone else who's ever been treated unfairly." The ripple effect. As the family ventured out to explore Cancun, the overwhelming beauty of the place offered moments of peace and joy. Diego laughed as he ran along the beach, the sand squishing beneath his toes, while Sofia marveled at the tiny crabs scuttling along the shore. Carlos and Maria shared a quiet moment, watching their children with a mix of pride and relief. Still, the ripples of their decision to speak out continued to grow. By the second day of their vacation, the airline had issued a public statement acknowledging the incident and pledging a thorough investigation. Emily had been placed on leave pending the outcome, and the company promised to review its training programs to prevent similar incidents in the future. Advocacy groups began using the Hernandez family story as a rallying cry for change in the airline industry, demanding better accountability and training to combat discrimination. The family's post became a touchpoint for broader conversations about prejudice, sparking debates in forums and news segments. Carlos and Maria remained at the center of it all, balancing the attention with their commitment to enjoying the vacation they'd worked so hard to plan. Despite the weight of the situation, they'd made time to snorkel in the crystal-clear waters, visit local markets, and share laughter over meals of fresh seafood. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset, Maria leaned into Carlos, her voice soft. "You've always been my rock," she said. "Even when things felt impossible, you stood up for us." Carlos wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "I couldn't have done it without you. We're a team, remember?" Maria smiled, her eyes glistening. "Always." The Hernandez family had come to Cancun seeking relaxation and adventure, but they had found something far greater. A renewed sense of purpose, a reminder of their strength, and a chance to inspire change, not just for themselves, but for everyone, from victims to advocates. The days passed in a blur of sunlit beaches and vibrant local culture, but beneath the surface of their vacation, the Hernandez family story continued to ripple outward. Carlos and Maria found themselves balancing moments of joy with their children and the increasing momentum of their fight for justice. The initial shock of going viral had faded, replaced by a sense of responsibility. On their fourth morning in Cancun, Carlos received a message from a legal advocate who specialized in discrimination cases. The advocate, a woman named Teresa Morales, offered her services pro bono, expressing admiration for the courage the family had shown in speaking out. Carlos and Maria scheduled a video call with Teresa that evening once Sofia and Diego were asleep. Sitting on the balcony of their hotel room, they connected with her. Teresa's warm smile and calm demeanor immediately put them at ease. "I want to start by saying how much I respect what you've done," Teresa began. "It's not easy to stand up against injustice, especially when you're in the public eye. but your story has already made a difference. Thank you, Carlos said, his voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. We never intended for this to go so far, but now that it has, we want to make sure it leads to real change. Teresa nodded. That's where I can help. The airline's public statement is a good first step, but words aren't enough. We need to ensure their promises are backed by action, policy changes, better training, and real accountability. Maria leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. What does that process look like? It starts with a formal complaint, Teresa explained. We'll outline the specific incidents that occurred, supported by the video evidence and witness statements. From there, we'll push for a meeting with the airline's leadership to discuss systemic changes. Carlos frowned. Do you think they'll actually listen? Teresa's smile was confident. They will. Public pressure is a powerful motivator, and your story has already captured national attention. But more importantly, you're not alone. There's a growing community rallying behind you. Maria reached for Carlos's hand, her gaze steady. We want to do this, she said firmly. Not just for us, but for everyone else who's ever been treated unfairly. Carlos nodded, his resolve solidifying. We're in. The movement grows. With Teresa's guidance, Carlos and Maria drafted a detailed complaint to the airline, emphasizing the impact of Emily's actions on their family. The document was a blend of professionalism and raw emotion, highlighting the systemic issues that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. Meanwhile, their story continued to gain traction online. Advocacy groups began organizing petitions demanding industry-wide reforms, from better training for airline staff to clearer policies on handling complaints of discrimination. Passengers from around the world shared their own experiences, many of which mirrored the Hernandez family's ordeal. News outlets reached out for interviews, and Carlos and Maria carefully chose which opportunities to accept. They appeared on a popular morning show via video call, sharing their story with a national audience. The host, a well-known advocate for social justice, praised their courage and asked what they hoped to achieve. Our goal is simple, Carlos said during the interview. We want accountability, not just for what happened to us, but for the way people are treated across the industry. Everyone deserves respect, no matter where they're from or what they look like. Maria added, this isn't about punishment. It's about progress. We want to see policies that prevent this from happening again. Their words resonated deeply, sparking conversations across social media and in homes around the country. The Hernandez family had become more than victims of an unjust experience. They were advocates for change, a symbol of resilience and determination, a surprise ally. As their story spread, an unexpected message arrived in Carlos's inbox. It was from one of Emily's former colleagues, a retired flight attendant named Karen, who had worked with Emily at the same airline for several years. Karen's message was heartfelt and apologetic. She explained that she had left the airline a year earlier, but had witnessed similar behavior from Emily during their time working together. She always seemed to target passengers she perceived as different, Karen wrote. I reported her once, but nothing came of it. I regret not pushing harder. I want you to know that what happened to your family wasn't your fault. It was part of a pattern. Carlos shared the message with Maria and Teresa, who saw it as a critical piece of evidence. This could strengthen our case, Teresa said. It shows that the issue isn't just about one flight. It's about a failure of oversight and accountability within the airline. Karen agreed to provide a formal statement, further bolstering the Hernandez family's position. Her courage inspired others to come forward, including a current flight attendant who anonymously shared her experiences of witnessing discrimination within the company. Family resilience. Amid the whirlwind of advocacy and legal preparation, the Hernandez family made a conscious effort to focus on their original goal, enjoying their vacation. They spent their days exploring Cancun's vibrant culture, from the bustling markets of El Centro to the tranquil beauty of Isla Mujeres. The children's laughter, unburdened by the weight of their parents' concerns, was a constant reminder of why Carlos and Maria were fighting so hard. One afternoon, the family visited an ecological park where Sofia and Diego finally got their wish to see dolphins up close. Watching their children's faces light up as they interacted with the gentle creatures, Carlos felt a surge of gratitude. Despite everything, they were creating memories that would last a lifetime. As they walked back to their hotel that evening, Sofia looked up at her parents. "Papi, Mama," she said, her voice earnest. "Why was that lady on the plane so mean to us?" Carlos and Maria exchanged a glance, the question they'd been dreading now spoken aloud. Carlos knelt down to meet his daughter's gaze. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "people don't understand others who are different from them. And instead of being kind, they let their fear or anger turn into bad behavior." Sofia frowned, her young mind processing his words. "But that's not fair." "No, it's not," Maria said gently, crouching beside Carlos. "And that's why we're speaking up, so that people learn to be kind and fair to everyone." Sofia nodded, her expression determined. "I want to help too." Carlos smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "You already are, mi amor." The airline responds. By the end of their vacation, the Hernandez family's efforts had begun to yield tangible results. The airline released a follow-up statement, announcing new initiatives to address the issues raised by the incident. These included mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all employees, a review of their complaint handling process, and the establishment of a passenger advocacy board. Captain Grant reached out personally to share the news, expressing his gratitude for their perseverance. "Your family's bravery has already made a difference," he said. "The changes being implemented wouldn't have happened without your voice." As the Hernandez family prepared to board their return flight, this time in first class, they felt a sense of closure. While the scars of their experience remained, they knew they had turned their pain into progress, not just for themselves but for countless others. As they settled into their upgraded seats, Sofia looked around in awe. "This is so fancy," she exclaimed, her earlier worries forgotten. Maria smiled, pulling her daughter close. "You deserve the best," she said softly. Carlos looked out the window, his hand resting on Maria's. Their journey had been far from easy, but it had reaffirmed something he'd always known: that together they could face anything. And as the plane soared into the sky, Carlos felt a renewed sense of hope, for his family, for their future, and for the world they were helping to change. A legacy of change. As the Hernandez family's plane touched down back home, the familiar skyline brought a sense of comfort and resolution. The flight had been everything their first one wasn't: calm, respectful, and even enjoyable. The crew had gone out of their way to ensure they felt welcome, a stark contrast to their initial experience. Yet Carlos and Maria knew their journey wasn't over. Their story had become a lightning rod for a larger movement, and the fight for justice was still in full swing. Coming home to a movement. When they exited the terminal, Carlos's phone buzzed with notifications. News outlets continued to cover their story. Advocacy groups had organized marches and forums, and their social media post had surpassed 1 million shares. Friends, family, and strangers alike had left messages of encouragement. One particularly touching message came from an immigrant family in another state. They had faced a similar experience, but had been too afraid to speak up. "Your courage gave us hope," the message read. "Thank you for standing up for all of us." Maria read the message aloud, her voice thick with emotion. "This is bigger than us now," she said softly, her hand resting on Carlos' arm. "We have a responsibility to keep pushing." Carlos nodded, his resolve strengthening. "We've come this far. We can't stop now." Turning pain into advocacy. Over the next few weeks, the Hernandez family immersed themselves in the movement their story had inspired. With Teresa Morales guiding them, they participated in meetings with the airline's leadership. The executives were careful to express regret and outline their planned reforms, but Carlos and Maria pushed for more concrete commitments. "We don't just want promises," Carlos said firmly during one meeting. "We want to see the results, real changes that make your passengers and employees feel safe and respected." The airline agreed to implement a new reporting system for complaints, ensuring faster responses and transparency. They also pledged to work with independent advocacy groups to audit their training programs. Meanwhile, the family continued to share their story, appearing on podcasts and panels about racial bias and systemic inequality. Carlos found himself in unfamiliar territory as a public speaker, but Maria's unwavering support gave him the confidence to step into the spotlight. "It's not about being comfortable," he said during one panel discussion. "It's about doing what's right. My family's experience was painful, but if sharing it can prevent others from going through the same thing, then it's worth it." A community united. The momentum of the movement brought unexpected allies. Local organizations reached out, offering to partner on initiatives that extended beyond the airline industry. Schools invited the Hernandez family to speak about the importance of empathy and standing up to injustice. Carlos and Maria were humbled by the opportunity to use their platform to educate others. Sofia and Diego, too, became part of the conversation in their own way. At school, Sofia shared her story with her classmates, inspiring a discussion about kindness and respect. Diego, though younger, proudly told his teacher, "My papi and mam are making the world better." Carlos and Maria marveled at their children's resilience and awareness. They had worried that the incident would scar them, but instead, it seemed to have ignited a sense of justice in their young hearts. The airline's next steps. A month after their return, the airline invited Carlos and Maria to a press conference where they unveiled their new policies. Among the changes were mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff, a zero-tolerance policy for harassment, and the creation of a passenger advocacy board that included representatives from diverse communities. Carlos and Maria were asked to speak at the event. Standing at the podium, Carlos looked out at the crowd, his nerves steadied by Maria's reassuring presence at his side. "This isn't just about my family," he began. "It's about every family, every individual who's ever been made to feel less than." Today's changes are a step in the right direction, but this work doesn't end here. It's on all of us to continue fighting for a world where respect and kindness are the norm, not the exception. The audience erupted into applause, and Carlos felt a weight lift from his shoulders. This moment didn't erase what had happened, but it was proof that progress was possible. A personal transformation. In the weeks that followed, Carlos and Maria found themselves reflecting on how much they had grown. Carlos, once content to avoid conflict, had discovered a well of strength he didn't know he possessed. Maria, who had always been the family's emotional anchor, had stepped into the role of a fierce advocate with grace and determination. Their relationship deepened as they navigated this journey together. They made time to celebrate their victories, big and small, while also supporting each other through moments of doubt. One evening, as they sat on their patio watching the sunset, Maria turned to Carlos. "Do you think we made a difference?" she asked, her voice soft. Carlos wrapped an arm around her, his gaze thoughtful. "I think we did. But more importantly, I think we showed Sofia and Diego that standing up for what's right matters." Maria smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "That's all I could ever ask for." Looking to the future, the Hernandez family's story continued to inspire others long after the initial wave of publicity faded. Advocacy groups used their case as a blueprint for addressing discrimination in other industries. Passengers who had once remained silent began speaking out about their experiences, emboldened by the family's example. For Carlos and Maria, life eventually returned to a semblance of normalcy, but they carried with them the lessons of their journey, using their newfound platform to mentor others and promote change in their community. One day, as they walked through a park with Sofia and Diego, Carlos overheard his daughter telling a group of children about her parents' fight for justice. "My papi and mam showed everyone that being kind is the most important thing," she said proudly. Carlos felt a lump in his throat, his chest swelling with pride. He glanced at Maria, who smiled knowingly. Their family had endured pain and humiliation, but they had emerged stronger, united by a shared purpose. And as they walked together under the warm afternoon sun, Carlos knew that their legacy would live on, not just in the changes they had inspired, but in the hearts of their children and everyone they had touched along the way.